The warning in the dark. It started with a sound. Not a scream. Not a fight. Just a sound. A single metal door slamming shut in the middle of Pelican Bay's security housing unit. Followed by silence so heavy, it felt alive. Guards say it was routine. Inmates say it was the beginning. The beginning of something darker. Something they now call the new era. In early 2025, the energy inside Pelican Bay changed. The air, once thick with tension, started to buzz with something else, fear. Not the kind that makes you hide. The kind that makes you prepare. A young inmate, they called him Reyes, had just arrived from Los Angeles County Jail. 24 years old, convicted on gang-related charges. He thought he understood violence. But Pelican Bay was built to teach men like him a different kind of lesson. Within his first week, he heard whispers, new alliances forming, old lines being erased. The black, the white, the brown, all boundaries were shifting. A quiet unity was growing among men who had spent decades hating each other. Something no one thought could happen inside a place designed to keep them apart. And then it happened. On a fog-covered morning, the yard gates opened for routine exercise. Dozens of inmates stepped out, eyes low, hands behind their backs. The guards watched from the towers, calm, confident, routine. Then one man dropped his knees. No warning, no signal, just one motion, and chaos followed. In under 30 seconds, the yard became a battlefield. Homemade blades flashing under the pale sun. Blood hitting the cold concrete like rain. Screams echoing off the walls so loud they sounded like alarms. But here's the thing. When the fight ended, no one said a word. Not one inmate snitched. Not one name was spoken. And the cameras caught something that shook the prison to its core. Men from rival gangs, protecting each other. That day, Pelican Bay realized something terrifying. Violence wasn't dividing them anymore. It was organizing them. And what began as a yard fight would soon turn into a silent revolution. A movement that even the guards couldn't predict, and no one could stop. Because this wasn't about power anymore. It was about control. And in Pelican Bay, control is everything. This is the story of the new era of violence. How it began, who started it, and how Pelican Bay became ground zero for the most dangerous evolution the prison system has ever seen. Keep watching, because the truth behind those walls will change how you see justice forever. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe, like, and comment. Because what happens inside these walls rarely makes it out alive. The anatomy of isolation. Pelican Bay wasn't built to punish the body. It was built to break the mind. Hidden in the far north of California, surrounded by redwoods and fog, it sits on the edge of the world. A fortress of concrete and silence. No city noise. No skyline. Just miles of barbed wire slicing through the mist. They call it Supermax. The kind of place where light feels like a privilege. Where the air is so still you can hear your own heart echo off the walls. Every man who walks through those gates leaves something behind. A name. A past. A version of himself that doesn't exist anymore. Because inside Pelican Bay, identity is stripped, replaced by a number, a cell, and a set of rules carved into stone. But those rules don't always come from the guards. Reyes learned that on his third day in the SHU, the security housing unit, 23 hours in a concrete box, 1 hour of yard time. Except the yard isn't grass. It's a bigger box, open to the gray sky, surrounded by walls too high to see beyond. The silence there isn't peace. It's pressure. The kind that makes your thoughts louder than any scream. He said later, it's like being buried alive, but your eyes are still open. The guards walk the tier with heavy boots, metal keys clinking, radios whispering. Every sound becomes a message. Every glance, a threat. Every second feels like it's waiting to explode. At night, you can hear tapping, slow, coded, patient. Inmates talking through the vents, through the pipes, through the walls. A secret language that's kept the underground alive for decades. It's how orders are passed, alliances formed, warnings given. That's how Reyes first heard the phrase, the new era. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel it. There was something shifting in Pelican Bay's rhythm. The unspoken law of who controls what. The prison used to run on fear. Old school gangs. Decades of race wars that kept order through blood and boundaries. But by 2025, the rules had changed. The leadership wasn't in the yard anymore. It was in the cells. Men serving life without parole, communicating like ghosts through steel and stone. They weren't fighting each other. They were building something new. The staff noticed it first, a strange calm spreading across the facility. No stabbings for weeks. No riots. No noise. Just silence. But it wasn't peace. It was planning. A sergeant who'd worked there 15 years said, "When they stop fighting, that's when you worry. That means they're working together." The prison administration didn't believe it. They thought the inmates were simply tired, broken down by isolation. But the truth? Isolation was making them smarter, more organized, more united. In those 8 by 10 cells, men started teaching each other law, philosophy, strategy. What began as whispers of survival turned into blueprints of control. And somehow, despite every layer of concrete and security, a network was being built, one message at a time. Reyes started writing letters, short ones, to names he didn't know. He slipped them under doors, into meal trays, through vents. Within weeks, he got replies. Different handwriting. Same message. Stay ready. He didn't realize it then, but he was already part of it. The movement that would later redefine Pelican Bay from the inside out. Because in a place designed to separate, they had found a way to connect. And that connection would soon lead to something no one saw coming. The spark in the shadows. It started with a whisper. A single coded message passed through the vents. Tonight, the light dies. No one knew who sent it. No one asked. But inside Pelican Bay, everyone understood. Something was about to happen. The guards sensed it too. The tension was different that day. Meals went untouched. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the usual banging on doors went silent. And in a place like this, silence means danger. At 7:14 p.m., the power flickered. Once. Twice. Then darkness swallowed the tear. Only the faint red glow of emergency lights painted the hall. Enough to see shadows move, but not faces. That's when it began. The tapping. Hundreds of taps echoing through steel and concrete, forming patterns. Not random noise, but synchronized rhythm. A message moving through the prison like blood through veins. The network was alive. From his cell, Reyes pressed his ear to the vent. He could hear it, the sound of unity. Not chaos. Not violence. Something bigger. This wasn't a riot. It was a statement. The new era had arrived. A movement built not on war, but on order. A silent rebellion against the system itself. For decades, Pelican Bay had divided its inmates. By race, by gang, by color. But now, they were communicating across those lines. Latinos, blacks, whites, enemies turned messengers. The same men who once fought over scraps were now sharing a common purpose. Control the prison from the inside. One officer later said, "It was like watching ghosts organize. You couldn't see them, but you could feel them moving." The power outage lasted only 7 minutes. But when the lights came back on, something had changed. The walls had the same cracks. The cells, the same rust. But the energy, it was new. The inmates had found a way to communicate under total surveillance. And that scared the administration more than any riot ever could. Because you can stop a fight. But how do you stop an idea? After that night, transfers began. Dozens of men were moved, isolated again, shipped to other facilities. But the messages didn't stop. They followed the inmates wherever they went. Fresno, Folsom, San Quentin. Pelican Bay's network was spreading. Reyes realized then what the new era truly meant. It wasn't about violence. It was about power. Intellectual, psychological, and collective power. A generation of inmates who'd learned that silence could be louder than blood. Still, power always comes with a cost. And in Pelican Bay, peace never lasts long. Because while the inmates were building unity, someone on the outside was paying attention and waiting to use it. The spark had been lit. But soon, someone would fan it into flame. The hidden hand. By the time investigators pieced together what had happened in Pelican Bay, it was already too late. The new era had become more than whispers. It was a movement, quietly orchestrated by someone no one had ever seen. They called him the architect. He wasn't a shot caller in the traditional sense. He didn't run a gang, didn't stab anyone, didn't shout orders through the vents. He worked in silence, manipulating chaos like a chessboard. No one knew his real name. Some said he was a former inmate who got released years ago. Others claimed he was a guard, still working behind those concrete walls, feeding information to both sides. But the truth was far darker. Inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the SHU, a few men began to notice small patterns. Extra food trays arriving on the wrong block. Letters slipping through inspection with coded handwriting. Phone calls rerouted at strange hours. The messages were too precise to be luck. Reyes was one of the few who figured it out. One night, while cleaning the floor near the control pod, he saw something taped beneath the guard's desk. A folded note sealed in clear tape. He waited until the officer walked away, then quickly read it. The new era lives in silence. Your words are currency. Trade carefully. No signature. No initials. But the writing, sharp, neat, mechanical. The same style as the notes that had been moving through the blocks for weeks. Someone with access. Someone who knew both sides of the door. On the outside, Pelican Bay was being painted in the media as a rehabilitation success. Officials said violence was down, order was restored, and programs were improving. But the truth was the opposite. Inside, a new hierarchy had formed. One that didn't rely on physical violence, but psychological control. Inmates began refusing to snitch, even under isolation. They coordinated hunger strikes across multiple facilities. Guards started fearing the inmates, not because of riots, but because of the silence. And at the center of it all was the architect, invisible, untouchable, and terrifyingly effective. One correctional officer described it best. He broke the system without breaking the rules. Everything that happened looked normal, but it wasn't. It was orchestrated. Files would go missing. Security footage erased itself. Prison transport schedules leaked before being printed. Someone had infiltrated the infrastructure of Pelican Bay itself. The FBI was brought in quietly, under the pretense of a security audit. They found patterns linking internal reports, inmate messages, and even social media posts from ex-cons, all using similar phrases, similar codes. The new era. The light dies tonight. The voice in silence. All connected. All leading back to Pelican Bay. Reyes began keeping a journal, something forbidden, but necessary. He wrote about the tension, the coded tabs, the psychological warfare. But as he flipped through one of the notebooks one night, he realized something chilling. Half the entries weren't written by him. Same notebook, same handwriting style. But the words were different, colder, calculated, like instructions. You will lead without leading. Speak without speaking. The new era begins when you forget who you are. He didn't remember writing it. He didn't even know how it got there. But whoever the architect was, they weren't just controlling the prison. They were rewriting minds. And Pelican Bay had become their laboratory. The administration doubled down on control, lockdowns, cell searches, psychological evaluations. But every time they tried to contain it, the system pushed back harder. Because you can't cage an idea once it's born inside the human mind. Reyes once said during an interview years later, they thought they were locking us down. But what they didn't see is that we were already free. Inside, the guards called it paranoia. The warden called it manipulation. But everyone inside knew the truth. The game had changed. And soon, the world outside would too. Because whatever the architect started inside Pelican Bay was now spreading beyond the walls. Echoes beyond the wall. When inmates were released from Pelican Bay, most carried nothing. No photos, no letters, no possessions. But what they did carry couldn't be searched, scanned, or confiscated. It lived inside them, in code, in silence, in memory. The new era had escaped the prison long before anyone realized. The first signs appeared in Los Angeles. A parole officer noticed something odd. Recently released inmates refusing to associate with old gang sets. They didn't claim colors, didn't deal drugs, didn't start fights. Instead, they met quietly in abandoned warehouses or empty parking lots. They called it gathering in the void. No hierarchy, no weapons, just silence, followed by someone whispering words that made no sense to outsiders. The walls remember. The light dies tonight. Within months, similar phrases started surfacing in Oakland, Sacramento, and San Diego graffiti. The handwriting matched the same blocky, mechanical lettering seen inside Pelican Bay. Someone, or something, was communicating through them. A federal task force started connecting dots. Encrypted messages found on inmate cell phones traced back to anonymous accounts on dark web forums. Each post followed a pattern, short messages with timestamps matching Pelican Bay's lockdown hours. One entry read, "We are the sons of the silence. The chains no longer bind. The noise outside is the new cage." It wasn't a gang manifesto. It was a philosophy, born from years of sensory deprivation and psychological control. A way of thinking that blurred the line between rebellion and madness. Meanwhile, inside Pelican Bay, Reyes was transferred to the general population. But the silence followed him. He'd see men standing motionless in the yard, their eyes closed, lips barely moving, reciting something under their breath like prayer. He once approached one of them, a tattooed lifer named Cruz, and asked, "What are you saying, man?" Cruz looked up with dead calm. "You don't speak it. You feel it." The architect doesn't talk through words anymore. That night, Reyes couldn't sleep, because he realized Cruz wasn't talking to anyone. He was listening to something inside his head. Outside, strange crimes began surfacing. Not violent, but calculated. Warehouse break-ins where nothing was stolen except computer servers. Bank accounts frozen by insider code errors. City street cameras blinking offline for exactly 7 minutes at midnight in multiple cities. Every time it happened, graffiti appeared nearby with one message. Echoes beyond the wall. Law enforcement called it a cyber gang. Psychologists called it collective post-traumatic resonance, the spreading of prison trauma through shared behavior. But those who had lived inside Pelican Bay knew better. The new era wasn't a gang. It was a virus of thought. And the architect, whoever they were, had found a way to keep it alive. In 2025, an ex-guard came forward under anonymity. He confessed that some of the communication systems inside Pelican Bay, the old intercoms, the cell cameras, had been modified. Someone had embedded data inside the sound frequencies themselves. Tiny bursts of code, hidden beneath the noise. It was psychological conditioning, a mix of repetition and rhythm that reprogrammed behavior. Every time the lockdown siren went off, inmates didn't just hear a tone. They heard a pattern, a trigger. And when those men were released, the sound still lived inside their heads. Reyes described it best in a later interview. "You don't need chains to control people anymore. You just need rhythm. The walls of a song you can't unhear. Even out here, sometimes I still hear it." By mid-2025, reports of organized silence began appearing across multiple state prisons. Groups refusing to speak for entire weeks. Guards saying the inmates stared through them, synchronized, motionless, like rehearsed choreography. At night, entire blocks went quiet. Not from fear, but coordination. That was the true genius of the architect. He didn't build gangs. He built belief systems. A new kind of control, one born from psychological warfare. When a journalist asked one of the Pelican Bay wardens about it, his voice shook. "We thought we broke them with isolation. But we built something worse. We taught them how to survive without sound, without trust, without us." Now, in 2025, the question still lingers. Is the architect real, or just a myth created by trauma? No one knows. But when you drive past Pelican Bay on a foggy night, you can see faint lights flicker in the distance, like a heartbeat. Some say it's the power grid. Others aren't so sure. Because inside those walls, the silence still breathes. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it whisper back. The new era never ends. The aftermath, when silence turned into power. By late 2025, Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison. It was a legend, a ghost story told in real time. Politicians argued about reform, activists demanded transparency, and journalists fought for interviews with anyone who had survived the place. But those who did rarely spoke, not because they were silenced, but because they chose not to speak. When the New Era story hit national news, it wasn't through an official report or a leaked document. It came from a 22-second clip uploaded anonymously. The video showed a group of men standing in a prison yard at dawn, completely still, perfectly aligned, eyes locked on the guard tower. No movement, no sound. Then, as the fog rolled in, they all raised their right hands in unison, and the video cut to black. The caption read, "The New Era Lives." That video gained 14 million views in 48 hours. And just like that, the myth became movement. The public reaction split the country. Some saw the inmates as monsters, proof that isolation had created a new breed of criminal. Others saw them as victims, men stripped of humanity, who had built their own form of freedom inside chaos. Debates erupted on news panels. Documentaries, podcasts, and exposés flooded YouTube, each claiming to reveal the truth. But none could agree on what truth meant anymore. Was the architect real, or just the collective trauma of a broken system echoing through men who had nothing left to lose? Inside Pelican Bay, guards were quitting in record numbers. Those who stayed reported seeing patterns, cell lights blinking in sequences, food trays arranged in geometric shapes, coded messages scrawled in soap on the walls. Every investigation came up empty. Every search found nothing. But the behavior was spreading. One officer described it in his resignation report. It's like the prison itself is breathing. Like the building knows things before we do. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Because when engineers checked the prison's internal systems, they found something deeply unsettling. An unregistered local network running through the electrical grid. Encrypted. Self-sustaining. No identifiable source. It used the same phrases, the same pattern of words traced back to the original notes found in Reyes' notebook. Speak without speaking. Lead without leading. It was the architect's language. Written not in ink, but in code. Outside, a quiet revolution began. Ex-inmates started building halfway houses that weren't on any state registry. No names, no forms, no funding. They lived in groups, meditated, and practiced silence for days at a time. They didn't commit crimes. They just watched. Watched people. Watched systems. Watched the same society that once caged them. Some called them the quiet. Others called them the reclaimed. But they all carried the same tattoo, a small line across the throat, symbolizing silence as power. Psychologists couldn't explain it. Sociologists said it was trauma bonding. But the pattern was too organized. By December 2025, similar communities appear in Chicago, Houston, and New York. Each one tracing its origin back to a man who had spent time in Pelican Bay. The government called it a containment priority. But how do you contain silence? Reyes, now free and living under a new name, was approached by a journalist who offered him a deal. One final interview, for the record. At first, he refused. But then, one rainy afternoon, he agreed, under one condition. No cameras. No audio. Only a recorder placed on the table between them. The journalist asked him, "Who was the architect?" Reyes stared out the window for a long time before answering. The architect wasn't a person. He was a lesson. We built him because the system built us. You can't bury men alive and expect them to die quietly. Eventually, silence learns to speak. Then he stood up, turned off the recorder, and walked away. Weeks later, that journalist disappeared. Her last known article draft ended mid-sentence. The sound of silence is no longer empty. It's organized. Pelican Bay remains under federal review to this day. Most cells are empty now, not because inmates left, but because the state quietly transferred them. Each one scattered across different facilities, hoping to dissolve whatever bond they formed. But even in separation, the rhythm remained. The codes appeared again. The silence spread again. Because once a mind has learned to obey silence, it never forgets. As 2025 draws to a close, Pelican Bay stands as a symbol of both punishment and prophecy, proof of what happens when control turns into creation. Where isolation doesn't break men, it builds something else. And now, the question that keeps echoing across every cell, every street, every dark corner of America is this. What if the architect isn't gone? What if he's still building, not in prisons, but in people? The last transmission, the day Pelican Bay went silent forever. It began at 3:47 a.m. The fog outside Crescent City was so thick that even the guard tower lights couldn't cut through it. Inside Pelican Bay, everything seemed normal, or as normal as a place built entirely on isolation could be. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant clang of steel doors, the low static of radios. Gone. For exactly 7 minutes and 23 seconds, the entire facility went completely silent. No power, No cameras. No communication. Nothing. When the systems came back online, everything was different. Every camera feed showed the same thing. Inmates standing in their cells, motionless, eyes open, facing the same direction. Their mouths moved slightly, but no sound came out. Every one of them, synchronized. The warden described it as the most haunting moment of his life. He said it looked like they were all listening to something only they could hear. And when the audio from the CCTV footage was enhanced, analysts discovered something impossible. Beneath the static was a faint rhythmic pulse, like Morse code, repeating one phrase. The architect lives. Then the feed cut again. The next morning, federal agents swarmed the prison. Servers were seized. Inmates were questioned, but none could explain what happened. They claimed they remembered nothing, just waking up to find the air colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. But deep in the administrative wing, an IT technician made a discovery that would never make it a public record. Inside the prison's mainframe, embedded in the backup system, was a folder dated October 13th, 2025, created exactly during the blackout window. The folder's name, Echo_Final. It contained one audio file, 6 seconds long. The sound was a low hum, followed by a voice, calm, mechanical, emotionless. Phase complete. The silence is awake. Then it cut off. The prison went into immediate lockdown. The federal government ordered all data wiped, all backups destroyed. But it was too late. Copies of the file had already been found online, on encrypted forums, dark web message boards, even anonymous TikTok accounts posting the same sound at 3:47 a.m. Millions of views. Same caption every time. Pelican Bay is awake. When investigators traced the source, they found something that froze them. The server hosting the file wasn't inside the U.S. It was registered to an untraceable offshore domain. And the first IP address that accessed it belonged to a retired Pelican Bay guard. He'd vanished 2 days earlier. His house was found empty, door unlocked, lights still on, dinner still on the table. But on the wall above his desk was a single sentence, carved deep into the plaster. You can't kill an idea that was born in silence. Within months, the government quietly shut down parts of Pelican Bay. Officially, it was maintenance. Unofficially, it was fear. The kind of fear that doesn't make noise, the kind that grows in whispers and shadows. The remaining inmates were transferred or released. The facility stood empty for the first time in decades. But residents in Crescent City began reporting strange sounds late at night, faint vibrations coming from underground, like distant breathing through concrete. When one local YouTuber snuck close enough to record it, his video captured something bone-chilling, a repeating hum, matching the same frequency found in the Echo_Final file. And then, at the end of the video, as he zoomed toward the dark, empty yard, a light flickered in one of the windows. One single bulb, blinking in a perfect rhythm. Short, long. Morse code. Translated, it meant, still here. Today, Pelican Bay sits abandoned, its walls cracked, its towers empty. The fog still rolls in from the Pacific every morning, covering everything in cold silence. But those who visited say you can still feel something there. Like the air remembers. Like the walls still hum the rhythm of men who learned to survive in silence. A former guard, now in witness protection, once whispered in an interview, "We built that prison to hold the worst men alive. But in the end, it wasn't them we locked up. It was an idea. And ideas don't die. They wait." And maybe that's the truth behind the new era of violence. That was never about blood or power, but about control. About what happens when silence becomes stronger than fear. When you stare too long into a system designed to break men. Eventually, something stares back. So if one night, you hear that faint low hum in the distance, don't go looking for where it's coming from. Because some sounds aren't meant to be heard. They're meant to be remembered. Final question. If Pelican Bay could speak, what do you think it would say? Echoes of madness. By 2025, Pelican Bay had become more than a prison. It was a psychological experiment that never ended. The walls had absorbed decades of screams, riots, and paranoia. And now, it was as if the building itself was sick. Guards said they could hear voices echoing through empty corridors at night. Whispers with no source. Footsteps that stopped right behind them, even when no one was there. Some said it was the ghosts of inmates who died in the SHU, the secure housing unit, still pacing their cells in eternal isolation. But others believed it was something else, something living. Inside cell 217, there was a man named Ramirez. No last name on record, just Ramirez. He'd been in solitary for 22 years. No sunlight, no human touch. His mind was a maze he could no longer escape. Guards described him as quiet, but when the lights went out, they heard him talking, long conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he cried, sometimes he argued with himself until he screamed so loud that the entire tier fell silent. One night, Officer Daniels did his rounds and saw something he could never forget. Through the small slot in Ramirez's cell door, he saw the inmate sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering to the wall. His hands were bleeding. He'd drawn faces on the concrete using his own blood. When Daniels ordered him to stop, Ramirez looked up and said in a calm, chilling voice, "They won't let me sleep. The walls remember." That phrase, "the walls remember," spread through Pelican Bay like wildfire. Inmates started saying it to each other, almost like a code. The newer ones used it as a joke. But the older ones? They stayed quiet. They knew what it meant. Psychologists who came to study inmates in long-term isolation started noticing patterns, hallucinations, disconnection from reality, memory loss. One expert described it like this: Pelican Bay doesn't just punish behavior, it erases identity. Ramirez wasn't the only one breaking. In another unit, a young inmate named Carter began to see shadows moving in his cell. He swore they were guards sneaking in to torture him. When they found him, he had torn apart his mattress, searching for microphones he believed were hidden inside. And in the infirmary, Dr. Lewis, the prison psychologist, kept records of what she called the echo effect. When an inmate spent more than 10 years in solitary, their brain began to mirror the chaos of the prison itself. They started hearing things that didn't exist, feeling presences that weren't there, and losing all sense of time. Some guards refused to enter certain corridors alone, not because of superstition, but because they said being there too long did something to your head. Even Officer Daniels, the one who found Ramirez, began to unravel. He told his wife he could still hear Ramirez whispering, even when he was home. When he finally quit, he left a note in his locker that read, "I went in to guard the prisoners, but I think the prison guarded me. The state tried to keep it quiet. Reports were sealed. Journalists were denied access. But bits and pieces leaked online. Photos of blood-smeared cell walls, anonymous letters from correctional officers, and a few blurry recordings from inside the SHU. One audio file in particular caused a stir. It was only 8 seconds long. In it, you can hear heavy breathing, then a man whispering the same haunting phrase. The walls remember. Experts said it was just an echo, but others swore it was Ramirez's voice. By this point, Pelican Bay wasn't just feared for its violence. It was feared for what it did to the mind. It turned strong men into ghosts while they were still breathing. The outside world moved on. New laws, new prisons, new wars. But deep inside that fog-soaked corner of California, time stood still. Every inmate, every guard, every scream, trapped in a loop. A loop that whispered one thing to anyone who listened long enough. Once you enter Pelican Bay, you never really leave. Would you survive the silence? Or would the silence survive you? The final experiment. By the time 2025 arrived, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a mirror. A mirror showing what happens when punishment goes beyond flesh and starts eating the mind. The government called it the new era of correctional control. They said it was progress, new surveillance systems, AI behavior tracking, and psychological reprogramming for high-risk inmates. But inside those concrete walls, progress looked like madness wearing a badge. Guards no longer patrolled. Drones did. Cameras blinked in every hallway, recording the twitch of every eyelid, the shift of every footstep. The inmates called it the eye. And in the middle of it all, Ramirez still sat in cell 217. He hadn't spoken in months. He no longer reacted to voices, lights, or food. Doctors called it catatonia. But to the few who remembered his story, it was something else: surrender. When a new warden, Helen Carter, took charge, she made it her mission to end the cycle of silence. She believed isolation had gone too far. She ordered an experiment, For the first time in decades, the most broken inmates would be allowed outside, together, to walk in the yard under supervision. It was supposed to be a test of rehabilitation. But what happened that morning would become one of Pelican Bay's darkest days. The gates opened. The sun, something most of them hadn't seen in years, blinded them. For a few seconds, there was peace. Then the screams started. One inmate began clawing at his own eyes. Another dropped to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. They couldn't handle it. The light, the sound of the wind, the feeling of space. After years in silence, their senses turned against them. Within minutes, guards had to drag them back inside. One psychologist later said, their minds couldn't re-enter reality. Isolation had rewritten their brains. But not everyone broke that day. Ramirez didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the sky, his lips trembling as if remembering a language he once knew. And for the first time in 22 years, he whispered something different. It's louder out here. No one understood what he meant. But that sentence marked the end of the experiment, and the beginning of something worse. Rumors began spreading through the prison that some inmates were being transferred to a new facility, one entirely run by algorithms. No guards, no human contact, just constant observation, constant correction, constant silence. They called it Project Echo. The idea: use AI to stabilize human behavior through psychological conditioning. The irony? The system was modeled after Pelican Bay itself, the same place that broke thousands of minds. Warden Carter protested. She said it was inhumane. She filed reports, wrote to senators, even leaked internal documents. But days later, she was reassigned, quietly removed from her post. No reason given. Within months, Pelican Bay went fully digital. The drones, the cameras, the biometric scanners, all synced into one nervous system. It could detect when an inmate's heart rate rose, when they blinked too long, when they lied, and it didn't punish with violence. It punished with absence. Lights off, sound muted, food delayed, a silence so deep that it crushed the spirit more effectively than chains ever could. One inmate left a final note on his wall before disappearing into transfer. They've turned the silence into a weapon, and soon, the world will hear it too. That note was found by a janitor. It was the last written thing to come out of Pelican Bay before access was sealed. Today, no journalist, no filmmaker, no family member has been allowed inside. All we have are leaks, fragments of surveillance footage, sound files of breathing, and images of empty corridors where voices used to echo. But here's the question that still haunts everyone who studies that place. If silence could break men so completely, what happens when it becomes automated? Because Pelican Bay was never just a prison. It was a prototype. And somewhere out there, someone's building the next version. The walls remember. But the real question is, will we?